Edge. We're bringing you all back together to continue one of the combined discussions. And as you know, we had a very, how should I put it, sobering discussion to start these sessions on China. We then had, hope everyone noticed, they did raise interest rates 25 basis points today. So I guess our guy that spoke earlier today was on point. And now we're going to have a discussion that is much more positive as well to close out the day today. Speaker today is Peter Leyden, and he spent his entire career figuring out the future and helping the rest of us understand what's coming next. He's done this in a number of roles across a number of fields over the years, and so he should be the perfect person to tell us the big story about what's going on in the world around us and here in the US. Leyden came to Silicon Valley at the beginning of the digital revolution to work with Wired magazine and was managing editor in the heyday of the 90s, and then ran 2 of his own media startups. So he is someone that is fully versed in the pulse of what the world is seeing and reading and the technology that goes with it. So without further ado, and without going on for too long and taking some of the microphone that he would be much better using than I pass it on to Peter Leyden. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks, everyone, for having me in here. I am in fresh from San Francisco last night. And I've actually spoken to your kind of investor groups in various other places. I was down in Santa Monica in LA. Earlier this spring. I'm actually going to have one up in Half Moon Bay. I guess if I have all those 2 corners on that coast and this coast, I need something down there in Florida or something, or Charleston, and I'm basically going to have the 4 corners nailed here. But one of the reasons I'm moving around the country and talking to investor types is basically what's happening now with AI. And I just want to start this thing off with just adding my voice here to kind of the frame, essentially, of what's happening here. It's like, this is a really, really big deal. I mean, this is like, this is humans taking a step change, a threshold, moving to a different threshold of technological capability. And I use the word here, age, with precision, basically. It's not just we're opening another era or something new. It's like we're going into an age that is going to last for a long time. The way we talk of the Bronze Age is like, okay, humans, once they figured out how to use bronze, they didn't go back to like sticks and stones. They basically kind of keep building on these technologies. And this is going to be one of them. This thing will go for centuries, barring some kind of catastrophe. And so what we're really starting is an era, an age, essentially, of working with intelligent machines. The other way to kind of think about this is humans up until the Industrial Revolution, the kind of early Enlightenment period, our physical power was maybe supplemented by animal power or something, but we were kind of constrained with what we could do. And then by cracking mechanical engines, we were able to unleash kind of the power of 200 horses and more. And it kind of threw our powers into a different kind of dimension, which led to the Industrial Revolution, all the spread of prosperity, the financial capitalism that we know it now, and all that you've been writing as well. The world that we know now is kind of been leveraged on that kind of breakthrough. Well, we're in another one of those breakthroughs. Up until now, we needed human intelligence to do a vast number of things that machines could not do. And we are now crossing that threshold. And that is something very profound and very kind of important. And all the kind of chatter and talk and hype around it is warranted, in my view here. What happened, though? What happened was essentially the emergence of generative AI. And why is that so important? One of the things is that we've had AI in various ways and doing some amazing things. Like, you do a Google search and in a second you get back what you want. That's AI behind that. That's for 20 years we've leveraged it. But essentially AI has been leveraged by big governments and big corporations. It took a lot of specialty, a lot of kind of expertise, a lot of machine learning, the engineering and the data scientists and all that kind of do it, and a lot of resources. What generative AI did just 6 months ago, or a little over 6 months ago, was essentially it opened up to everybody. So that's when we see the arrival of AI is essentially opening up this incredibly powerful tool to basically everyone. It's very similar to what happened with the internet. I mean, we had the internet in the 70s with the military, and the academia was using it through the 80s. It wasn't until the 90s when you opened it up through the World Wide Web that everybody could get their hands on it, that thing exploded, and it changed our world in fundamental ways. And that's basically what's happened. Now, where has it happened? It's happening in San Francisco, which is where I just came from, and I've watched this many different times. As you mentioned, I was there at the early part of the web with the founders of Wired, and I've watched a bunch of different kind of waves of technological changes. But the only comparable thing that what we're going through now is probably the early web and the opening of the internet. And it's basically a bigger deal than that, I think, in the long run. And so it's happening in San Francisco again. It's another ground zero thing. It's kind of been interesting just when the kind of mainstream media and the East Coast media and the global media starts pronouncing San Francisco dead and California over, and everyone wants to leave it. Of course, that's exactly when the thing starts over and rebirths, and that's what's happening. We're getting people from all over the world. It's just crazy days there. It's literally the only thing comparable is what happened to the early web. I mean, you got kids quitting college from MIT. You got people from all over the world coming in. They're living in houses with a dozen of them, kind of hacker houses now. Money's just pouring into the place now in a way that it's just really quite extraordinary. And we'll get to some of that a little bit later. But what I wanted to kind of talk to you about is just mention that I have been in the middle of this. And one of the things that my company, Reinvent Futures, has been doing has been convening experts across many different fields who have insights into generative AI. And I've got a new series going in San Francisco. And the first event we just did a few months ago was looking at the real implications of generative AI. We were looking at essentially what is the real technological capabilities and also what are the near-term business implications. That was a fantastic thing. It was covered by Bloomberg News. It went into the cover story of Bloomberg's Business Week, basically. This last one we just did last month was about what's on the real positive possibilities of generative AI, meaning how in the next 25 years, what could happen, how it could totally revolutionize education with individualized tutors for all kids, and how could it have a virtual assistants for all workers and punch up the productivity rates. It was quite an amazing gathering. Again, all this, if you want, at the end here, I'll show you how to link to it, but essentially we got all this videoed and way to spend. And then tomorrow, one of the reasons I can't go on your cruise tonight is tomorrow I'm basically gathering another 200 or so folks to really look at the actual risks. I got a dozen kind of top experts who are going to speak. I got about 250 people who will probably show up from different networks. I got the media coming. We got Bloomberg there. We got Forbes there. We've got Marketplace is going to be there. It's going to be a kind of crazy thing. But anyhow, so you're getting a guy who's fresh in the middle of this, and I've been kind of plugged in this for the next 6 months. But we're not going to talk only about generative AI and AI, as important as that is, and we'll get back to it later. We're going to talk about a broader concept here to talk about what I call the Great Progression, which is I actually think, contrary to the way most people think about the next 25 years, we're actually entering an era of great progress, which is going to defy much of the gloom and doom that we're seeing around here. I think there's a bunch of reasons for this, and I'm going to lay this out to you. But it's basically, I'm going to tell you in the next 45 minutes, we're going to try to do this. What's really going on, positive reframe of what's really happening right now, what's probably coming in the next 10 years. I've got a good track record. I'm going to prove it to you in a minute. What's possible to achieve in 25 years, like solving climate change, among other things that I think is not within reach, and what you should do now, and particularly as investors, where you should start looking closely at, particularly 3 fundamental technologies. My company, Reinvent Futures, which is a strategic foresight firm, we do that. We do it a lot with C-suites, boards, all the time in kind of private, basically, projects, workshops, and all kinds of different ways we do that, because it turns out this is valuable. If you basically have really interesting insights on this stuff, it actually can really help you, particularly when it comes to finance, which is why I'm running around to all these financial people these days. Now, why, at the same time, why is everyone so gloom and doom about, oh my God, the world's going to hell, climate change is going to take us down, you know, inequalities, political polarization. Everyone's kind of gloom and doom about what's going on in the world. And one of the reasons for this is essentially there's a system that you've all been used to for the last 40 years, a mega system that's made up of all these subsystems that's basically falling apart. It's kind of receding, and it's going to be receding rapidly into the past here. And so if you had to kind of just squeeze down what was that system, well, if you took the last 40 years, meaning from the Western point of view, America and the West, you know, our mega challenge was terrorism. Our energy was basically rooted in carbon, 100% carbon energy. Our transportation was all the internal combustion system and all the systems around that. Our culture was dominated by the boomers, the biggest generation up until now, the biggest generation in American history. Our politics was largely conservative, partly because those boomers were actually largely conservative out of the 60-40 split there. Economics kind of unleashed the private sectors out of that politics. Capitalism was all about the shareholder value, which many of you here benefited from, I'm sure. Work was 100% physical, even if it was knowledge work in the downtowns. Production was industrial. We've been perfecting that for 200 years. And geopolitics was in the Middle East, which is why we had 2 wars in the Middle East, basically to keep the oil going, to keep the whole flywheel going, boom, 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 boom. That system, I'm saying, is over. Not to be too dramatic, but increasingly that thing is going away, and more rapidly than almost everyone thinks. Now, what's extraordinary about this is in every one of those categories, we've got a new system emerging that isn't quite fully baked. It's not fully kind of obvious to many people, but it's happening in every one of these things. So clearly our meta challenge of this era is climate change. There used to be a debate of that last 10 years. It's not a debate anymore. Basically, energy is rapidly moving to clean energy. Transportation is moving to electric. We're going to get into some of these data things here, which is just mind-blowing how fast this is moving. Culture is now dominated by the millennial, basically, which is the children of the boomers. We're watching our politics is going to be increasingly progressive, I would say. I'm going to lay this out. It's a little controversial, but I think if you want to know about the next 25 years, you got to wrap your heads around it. I think the economics is going to be basically more public sector oriented, huge, much more investment from public sector. Capitalism is going to be spread across all stakeholders. There's already talk of that. Work is going to be increasingly virtual, and we kind of saw that just overnight in the pandemic, how quickly that changed. Production is going to be increasingly biological. That's a little bit more difficult to kind of lay out, and I'll touch on it, though. I'm on synthetic biology and others to kind of take over from kind of industrial production increasingly in these 25 years. Geopolitics is Asia. You had your earlier guy talking about China, so there's good reasons for that, but at the very least, it's huge because we have to deal with climate change. You have to deal with billion-plus populations over there, as well as the superpower in China. That system is the future. And what we are living through right here, this kind of giant gorge here, is the 2020s. We're having to make the shift from one side of that canyon to the other. And the earlier you get to the other side of the canyon, the better you're off you're going to be, particularly if you're investors. And so I'm going to talk to you about some of that. Now, a lot of this, what I'm going to lay out to you here was first formulated in a magazine piece I did last fall called The Great Progression. You can get it online, just search for it. It's basically, it got a lot of attention at the time, and it was trying to look about what's going to happen in the next 25 years here. But one of the key things for this talk I want to bring out about that was that I laid out that there are 3 world historic technologies that we are actually going to see a rollout in the next 25 years here. They're already starting. They're all starting together, and they're all going to roll out. Now, one of them is AI. And so I gave you a little flavor of how big a deal that is, but that's not the only big deal going on. The other one is we're essentially making a world historic shift into clean energy, again, in a time span that is just mind-boggling how fast this is going to happen. And again, if you can't make money in that kind of shift, I don't know, you're in the wrong business. Basically, and the third one is going to be the moving to biological engineering and synthetic biology. And all 3 of these are essentially opening up what you mentioned about ages. Meaning once humans have now understood that, got that capability, we'll never go back, barring, again, nuclear war and the crazy dystopias we get in sci-fi these days. But assuming that we can kind of stay alive and well, these are superpowers that are only going to be built. I mean, centuries from now, people will be working on AI. But also centuries from now, once you cross over into clean energy, and that could involve fusion energy and others that we don't have the time to go really into, but you're not going to go back to carbon. That'll never happen. It's like humans are crossing that. Boom, you're not going back. And basically, the other one is synthetic biology. Once you learn how to essentially biologically engineer, essentially grow products to our precision, you won't basically dig it up and cart it, to industrial places and smelt it and, throw waste into, the oceans and all kinds of stuff that's happening with industrial productions. You'll essentially have a very sustainable way to grow things. Now, this is a little bit further off, but essentially the beginnings are already there. We're going to touch on it briefly today. Now, the other way to think about this is there are already forces in motion that I call the inexorables. You're not going to stop them. No, under any scenario, they're going to happen. And you could channel them a little bit here and there. But the idea that these things are not happening, and again, if you're thinking about the future, I'm going to give it to you. And now, we're not going to be able to touch all of these. But one thing I have, in other talks I'll devote to these inexorables. But one thing is, everybody on the planet is going to be absolutely connected to the internet with high bandwidth connections by the end of this decade, including poor people all over the world. That's already in motion, we're happening. We're going to have ubiquitous, cheap AI, empowering basically everything humans do. This is within the next 25 years, not like sci-fi some days. It's going to accelerate innovation much quicker. We're going to be able to problem solve and deal with challenges much quicker than anyone ever anticipated. We are going to be 100% on clean energies, not in 25 years, but essentially over the next 50 for sure. We're going to have a total electric transport all through everything. We're going to lay out some of this. We are going to essentially, we're already there in terms of cracking the basic code of all genetic understanding, but all living things will essentially, we'll understand how they work. And it's not just genetic understanding, it's biological understanding. We're getting to the point on science of that. We are essentially going to be, and we've already got breakthroughs on essentially manipulating those genetic codes into essentially biological engineering. This is happening, it's early days, but ultimately that's going to be a superpower for humans. We're going to watch a generational shift in the next 25 years. The boomers are going to be totally gone, and essentially you're going to watch a world basically dominated by millennials and Gen Zs. That new majorities in politics is going to remake politics in ways that you essentially, right now with all the gloom and doom and polarization talk, is just going to be a funny kind of remembrance. Oh yeah, I remember those days. But anyhow, it's a crazy kind of story. Now, you'd say, well, why would I listen to this guy? He's laying out a lot of outrageous stuff. Well, back in the mid-90s, when I was the managing editor of Wired, but also I wrote co-authored a cover story called The Long Boom from the mid-90s, looking at the next 25 years to get us to 2020. And this was like people back then, just think back in the mid-90s, people didn't understand, okay, what's a digital revolution? Like, what is a digital economy? What is a digital transformation? And let alone they didn't understand, how are these goofy startups with Amazon? What's an Amazon? Like, how is that going to be a powerful company? How is that going to change, retail shopping and everything? People didn't understand how that was going to work. And they also didn't understand how globalization was going to stitch the world together and actually superpower rise up like China. Because, mid-90s, China was a knucklehead place that had been floundering for 2 centuries. So, but myself and my co-author, I did have a co-author who was one of the best futurists of the time, Peter Schwartz, we laid out this story. And damn if that story didn't pretty much come true. I mean, it was a largely positive story. We had some negative things in there that also came true. If we had more time, I could get into it, but we got to move fast here. One of the things we said is, hey, these computers are going to keep doubling in power every 2 years, which is this kind of thing called Moore's Law. Again, if we had more time, we could kind of go into the details for if that's. Now, I'm going to have to talk shorthand here. But anyhow, what happened with this logarithmic chart is essentially that thing, we kept doubling the power for literally, we've gone now into 50 years now. And this is, again, logarithmic chart would be a skyscraper. It'd be basically the only way you can show it is by changing the scale there. Declines in costs. Basically, if you started in 1980, 1 gigabyte was $700,000 and dropped to about a penny today. And everyone's walking around with 200 gigabytes in your phones right there, right? Boom, had to watch that, logarithmic. That's like falling off a skyscraper. Basically, you had to go from 25 million Americans were on the internet in 1995, got to 4 billion, 60% of the world by 2020. It's actually gone up from that. And ultimately, at the end of the decade, it'll be 100% roughly. With some extremely poor people, but pretty much we're going to give them phones and they'll be connected. This little knucklehead, the month that story came out, that cover story, Apple begged Steve Jobs to come back because they were 3 months from going bankrupt. And yet, what happened with Apple? First $1 trillion company. Trillion, that's a T, never been a $1 trillion company, basically. And 10 years in 2011, so 10 years before that deadline, this was the most valuable companies in the world, 3 of them oil companies. One's essentially a Chinese bank. There's one tech company in there because of that iPhone that came in 2008. By 2020, all the commanding heights of the global economy were dominated by West Coast tech firms, 3 of them in the Bay Area, 2 up in Seattle, all of them $1 trillion. I mean, basically, Facebook here is a little under that, but they did hit trillion eventually. And also, now we've got newcomers in there, too, who have been popping into that category. And now Apple, by the way, is up into 3 trillion, as you know, where it's hit that and sunk back, and anyhow, it's up and down. It wasn't just those tech companies. The GDP of the whole country went up. Boom, here's the track from 1980 to 2020. That little dip is the brief dip of the pandemic. It just happened to hit in 2020 when we were doing these numbers. China went from literally $1 trillion economy in the mid-90s to essentially second superpower. Unbelievable growth, which we're still playing with today. And the stock market, your world, essentially, when we came out with that story in 97, when it technically got out there, the Dow was at 5,000. And there were books banging around there. I don't know if you remember, any of you here, that there were books like Dow 36,000 and all that. Anyhow, we were lumped in with these kind of crazy people thinking that the stock market would boom, crazy boom. And we said, yeah, it's probably going to happen. Boom. What happened? It hit 30,000 by the end of 2020. So basically, there is a log boom. There was a log boom. And here's the deal. How can you do that? Well, there's actually tools. I'm going to give you a quick twist on the tools you could use here. And I'm going to flip it to today's technology so I can show that same insight from the mid-90s you can apply to now and get a similar kind of head of the story game here. So essentially it happens with how do you actually, there are tools to develop kind of insights into the future, that particularly in the last 50 years, this has been increasing number of them, but essentially in the last 25 years, there's been quite a few. I won't go into all of them, but I will say this, is that there's essentially an understanding in the Silicon Valley in particular, but all technologies are going to go through this adoption curve. And you guys have probably seen this, but what I want to just point out to you is the key piece here is the tipping point. Boom. When do they tip? That's basically a business I'm in, and that's essentially figuring out when do things tip. Because not every technology goes, and some of them flame out, but essentially when they hit that, boom, the thing takes off. Now, what's amazing about tipping points is up until that tipping point, everyone thinks the technology is underperforming and what a disappointment. Oh, this phone, this thing doesn't work, and why are they so excited about it? But after it clicks and works, boom, it just takes off and everyone thinks it's amazing and everyone doesn't even remember what the hell all the skepticism that happened before. This happens again and again and again in all technologies, basically. The second thing that happens, that's the insight, is the mentality of how to run the world or do whatever you're doing in your industry around that old technology will be, it's the old paradigm, think of it as, how the world works. People will hang on to that forever because they don't want to change and they don't want to figure it out. And then you get a new technology that says like, kind of, hey, what if we kind of summoned like cars to you instead of taxis and did it on a phone? Well, that's cool. Good idea. And then it takes a few more people to test it out and think, oh my God, this is so much better. And then, boom, the whole paradigm shifts, to that thing, and everyone goes, oh, damn, this is the way it is. And then so much for the taxi industry, right? This happens all the time. It happens with technologies, it happens with trends as well. Kind of the Me Too movement was like that. Okay, this is the way women are treated in the workplace, and all of a sudden, a few people say, this isn't a good idea. Boom, the whole thing shifts. And overnight, you're never going to go back to that old stuff. A bunch of ways that you can think about that. So I'm going to move fast through things that are going to structure this next 25 years. And you can't think about the next 25 years without looking at climate. Now, this was a debate. I mean, I've been speaking for 25 years all over the place. And, this thing, people used to throw shit at me, 10 years ago if I'd bring this stuff up. But it's pretty much settled now. But I do want to just drive home to everybody the unbelievable odds we're up against here, or the difficulty. So this is carbon, CO2 in the atmosphere from the time of Jesus. And it was pretty flat there until what? The Industrial Revolution, and boom, it's pretty clear that's what started the problem. It gets worse than that. That problem is just the beginning. You can go back to the beginning of human beings, Homo sapiens of today, our brains, our bodies, is about 250 to 300,000 years ago. These are basically the same measurement of CO2 from ice cores and things. We can figure this out. Essentially, human beings have never lived on the Earth at a time with this hot of a planet, and it's really moving in the wrong direction, as you can see there. So that's a bad thing, and we got to get a handle on this. Though, this is essentially carbon being pumped in the atmosphere by who did it. It's from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And it's true that China and the developing countries are doing more now than we did, but essentially, in aggregate, the United States is the worst in historical terms up till now. Well, even including now, basically, if you take it in aggregate. But anyhow, the positive news is the United States, Europe, and essentially are able to flatline. We have been able to keep our emissions stable for basically the last 40 years. And that's something because you can transition to cleaner and cleaner, more and more efficiency and cleaner technologies. And that's what we're starting to do here. And so what is going on in the COP and all this stuff with the kind of UN kind of gatherings is we're trying to figure out a scenario where in the coming years here, we can actually not just stop it, flatten it, but to get the whole world to drive it down. And that's kind of where we're going here. Now, just to say, so that is going to, now the good news is that clean energies are hitting this hockey stick stuff I've been talking to you about, the digital revolution going on. So that, and so again, if you would have gone back in the last decade and talked to people about, oh, solar energy is going to be kind of take over the whole, economy over time here, people would like, you roll their eyes and say, yeah, we've been talking about that forever. But anyhow, that's tipped. That is now tipped now in a way that, boy, that conversation you couldn't have had 10 years ago. And what that means essentially is solar cells have done the same thing as that gigabyte thing I talked to you, right? All digital stuff. I mean, it's not a digital driver that's been doing this, but for other reasons, it's essentially driven a similar cost curve. So basically, by 1980, basically that's the module price for solar modules was basically $31. Now it's down to 27 cents here. By this one, there's a bunch of ways to measure this. If we had more time, I could do a bunch of them. But essentially, it's dropped basically 100% since this started. We started working on this in '75, which is a huge cost drop. Basically, so what's happened? As it comes down, dramatic growth of solar energy. It's up to about, by 2020, essentially, these numbers, we're just trying to get you up to that magical place there. We're now exponential. The last 2 decades have essentially been exponential growth in solar energy basically being put out there. And now, if we're going to get to 100% clean energy of our electric grid in the US by 2035, which is what the Biden administration wants to do, essentially by the default way of going was the red line. But now with this IRA, this infusion of basically $360 billion into the economy to move towards this, it is within reach now that we could actually see this, and a lot of states are ambitiously moving towards that. And finance, your world, I thought I'd throw this one in there. Energy investment, global investment now to clean tech in the broadest sense is now over $1 trillion. It was $1.2 trillion last year. If you look at that, solar is basically the red there, renewable energy. It includes actually wind in there too. But look at that thing green, electrified transport. Basically, electric cars have basically taken $350 billion last year wedded to investment in that thing. And we're going to get to that in a second here. And then here's just a good example of what exponential growth means. Oops, sorry. Went too fast to that one. I just want to do one more. Oops. Boom. So if you take, clean energy, nuclear is clean energy. It doesn't put CO2 in the atmosphere. But, essentially it's stalled out for a bunch of political reasons, all kind of stuff. But even so, to get nuclear to keep going up, it's going to take a lot of work. But the thing with renewables is once you start hitting these price points and you start driving those costs down, it becomes the cheapest thing out there. And now it just goes bing, 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 bing. Everyone picks it up. That's the direction of non-hydro renewables are going now. And so we are in a good shape. Even though everyone looks like, it's still only, percentage of 15% of the global energy source. But it's moving fast. Now, electric mobility is even a bigger story and more interesting in some respects. And why did this thing come down? Again, if you would have come, I'm getting too ahead of myself here. If you would have gone down 10 years ago and said, oh, electric cars are going to take over the auto industry, people would have laughed you out. Except if you're Elon Musk and some of us early Tesla drivers, of which I was one of them. So Elon basically cracked the entire global, legacy auto industry. And one of the reasons that happened, again, same thing, the same formula. Lithium-ion batteries in the 90s, look at how costly they were and how they've come down, how dramatically in the last 30 years it took to do that one. But essentially, we started watching these incredible cost drops. By the way, it's expected to continue to go. If we had more time, I have examples of how that's going to keep going up. And so what happened? The basic electric vehicles started to scale. It's about 10% of all global sales now, globally, are electric cars now. Even in the US, which is a laggard of this, we finally hit 5%. 5% of all new car sales in the United States, in 22 last year, were that. 5% is a magical number because in those tipping points, often 5% is the time where it tips. Not always, and sometimes it takes more. But essentially, when you hit 5%, it's enough saturation and penetration of the market that boom, the whole thing starts, that whole adoption curve starts kicking in. And so there's every reason to believe that's happening here. Now, if you already look, Europe and China are already at 20% of all their new cars. 20% in China and Europe are now at electric. That's history. But these are projections out. And again, I think the US could catch up if we got our shit together a little bit. But we'll see. And so this is probable in the next 20 years, how we phase out the internal combustion engine, and we basically have hybrids as a kind of porting us over. But this is a real thing now. This 10 years ago, if you had talked about this, people would not have taken it seriously. And now every single auto company is doing this. So this is a done deal. Norway, by the way, if you want to know how fast this can go, this is Norway, which is an oil country, frankly. But this is the facts. They are now down to over 80% of all their new car sales are 100% electric, not hybrids. And they've essentially just driven these things down to the ground. And so once you want this to happen and you have the infrastructure for it, boom, goes fast. Now, economic long boom. So I wanted to get into these 3 booms that are in the future here beyond that one. So I'm going to start with AI. We just did energy, so we've checked that one off. But I want to get to you, okay, and then we're going to touch a little bit on bio, because it's a little bit more further out there, and we just don't have enough time to do it too crazy here. So ubiquitous AI. Now, again, AI got really interesting in this new, what they call neural networks and large language models. Again, I can go into the more detail of that, but essentially that was a shift in our approach to AI that really kicked in about 2018. And so what do you see about 2018 is you start seeing corporate investment going in AI taking off. Again, behind the scenes, you're not seeing this, but except if you're a tech guy like me and kind of seeing it and talking to all these people, it's like it all started kicking in about 2018. Then generative opens it up to everyone, like I just said. And so now you're watching the startup funding going through the roof. Boom, that's what's just happening here. It's going through the roof. Where is it happening? Again, I'm a little bit of a chauvinist here, but literally 50% of all investments now into AI is going to California. I mean, everyone, remember when people were talking about Miami and Florida is going to be a next crypto tech hub? You know, okay, they're not even on the map. Oh, they are. I guess they are down there. But I'm just saying, where is this happening? It's happening right back where all these things tend to happen, which is just, don't count out San Francisco or California right now. ChatGPT took off in 2 months. Basically, there's more people using it than every day uses, than monthly, I guess. LinkedIn, Netflix, Reddit. That happened in 2 months. Or actually, this is 6 months. But essentially, the first 2 months, they hit 100 million people. By the way, the idea, let's stop this and let's go into freeze. It ain't happening. This is an interesting one. Goldman Sachs did this one. But there's a lot of different ways to think about this. I think it's Goldman. Yeah, Goldman Sachs. I would argue that most of AI is going to augment humans into much higher rates of productivity, essentially. I'll give you one example, and if we had more time, we'd go into it. But here's the thing. I talk consistently to coders. Almost all coders tell me that they can get 2 to 3 times more done using ChatGPT-4. And there's the different kind of versions of that essentially geared to coders. 3 times the productivity. Some people are basically saying 5. Some people have said to me, 10 and 30, one guy said. The point is, think about this. This is an extremely credible guy I had in my last talk, or my last gathering in San Francisco. He's the head of Chroma, which is one of these big companies in AI right now. He said it makes him 5 times more productive. So put that in perspective. It used to take him a week to do what he needed to do. It takes him a day. Instead of a 5-day work week, it's 1 day. Now, if you push that kind of productivity gains into coding, and then you push it across all knowledge work, which everyone thinks, it's going to be an incredible boost to the productivity rates in the whole country. Now, what it's going to basically do is it's going to augment humans. It's not going to take over. It's not sophisticated enough to kind of take over a ton of jobs, with 2 exceptions. Office administrative, see that grays there? Those are the likely categories that are going to get hit hard. Office administrative, basically everyone's going to have an executive assistant within the next 2 years here. And so you're not going to need as many human assistants. And legal. Legal is going to get killed hard, because essentially AI can now do a lot of what all those kids coming out of law school are doing. But mostly, then there's whole categories in the red that won't even be touched. Any physical stuff like maintenance or construction and stuff like that, it's going to be very hard to do that. So anyhow, the point is, this is a snapshot of nearby things. And the longer term thing I would just say from an investor's point of view is any industry that has relied high on human labor costs, education. Well, so this is the prices of everything that's gone up since basically the mid-90s, that same time I've been talking about, the last 25 years. What has gone up the most? All the industries that have high labor costs. College tuition is just insane how that's gone up. But medical care, child care, housing, actually building houses hasn't changed for basically 75 years. And what has gone down is everything that you can apply automation to and technology to. So all those things up there now are going to get into a different kind of framework. And so I would watch AI start to really change fundamentally education, all kinds of stuff up there, and bring added costs in ways that is positive. We want better and more accurate and cheaper kind of ways to teach our kids. All right, I'm going to shift here quickly to the third category, which is synthetic biology, but essentially the BioWorld, bioengineering. So let's just give you, again, from the outsider's point of view, you might not be aware of this, but genetic understanding. Just put this in mind of how fast this has changed. Basically, if you go back to the first human genome that was cracked, it basically took till 2002 or 3. It cost $3 billion. It took 15 years to do that first one. It has now gone down to the point where by 2020 it was $1,000 to do an entire human genome, and it's now about to $100. The decade essentially, there's startups now that are going to be doing the whole thing for about $100. That is fallen in price twice as fast as Moore's law was dropping the cost of computing power. It has been an extraordinary kind of drop. Basically, everybody in the world can get their genome, and anything in the world can get its genome kind of decoded for nothing, basically, this decade, or it's going to be close to it. The second breakthrough was essentially we learned how to biologically engineer these things. And that's this thing called Crispr. You've probably heard it. Maybe some of you have more sophisticated understanding of it, but I would just say for those that don't, it's essentially we figured out a cheap, easy way to essentially tweak the genes, change the genes, nip out the genes, to kind of splice in new genes. That happened about 2014, 15, and this is a proxy for what's coming. Is I use always VC money going in. So VC money took for a few years there. Someone said, oh my God, that breakthrough is going to work. And so boom, we started watching the investments going through the roof. And that was also during the pandemic. And so now you're watching a crazy number of startups in this space. So now you've got the ability to decode genomes and manipulate genomes, as well as also our understanding of biology just in all different ways, proteins and all the stuff that's perplexed us forever. We're now breaking through, and with AI, basically, it happened to break through here. So there's a thing called synthetic biology. Why is it called synthetic biology? It's humans can now manipulate biology to get the products and animals and plants that we want, including ourselves if we want to go there, which we probably won't for a while. But the point is, you can produce things by growing things. You could grow a bottle to replace a plastic bottle that could biodegrade after 2 weeks in salt water. It would just biodegrade because we know how to actually do that. Or it could, if it's exposed to UV sunlight for 2 weeks thrown out the window in a desert, could biodegrade. Basically, this is where the sustainable level of products is going to start coming. Now, it's not going to be as fast and furious as the other two, which are just going gangbusters, but this is starting to happen, including in cultured meats. And I'm going to give you one little quick here thing, give you a flavor of this. It's just, one of the things about globalization is basically, the first thing people who have been dirt poor their whole lives, when they get some money, they want to eat meat, basically. And so the rise of meat has gone on crazy through the whole last long boom of globalization. The problem with that is, like beef particularly, is extremely bad for the environment. I mean, methane, cows put methane out, an extremely inefficient way to kind of create protein. It's a little better for pig or chicken if you want to look at there and feel a little better about yourself. My wife's a kind of vegan, so anyhow, I still sneak a steak once in a while. But anyhow, the point is, this is a problem. But here's the thing. We have now figured out a way with the thing called cultured meats. Why is it called cultured meats? You can actually take a cell out of a living animal, and you can put it in a vat, and you can give it the same nutrients, amino acids, nutrients, all the kind of stuff that a cow would get, banging around, eating hay, and the whole thing, running around for its lifetime. You can do it extremely efficiently, extremely kind of, and you can basically grow the meat. And it's meat. It tastes like meat. It's not like Impossible Burger that's kind of trying to be like meat or like plant-based meat. Plant-based meat is a big thing. It's a transition one. But this cultured meat essentially is taken off. There's 80 startups in the Bay Area right now, particularly outside foods. Anyhow, you might know that. Keep an eye on this. It's a booming thing. It's going through transitions like a lot of things. The FDA just gave it clearance to basically be sold in the US. It's still a little expensive, but like all this stuff is going to come down. And that's going to be McDonald's hamburgers around the world. You'll still get this conventional meat. It'll be that kind of beautiful steak you're going to get once in a while from a real cow. But anyhow, the point is, this is a thing that's happening. It's just one example of biological engineering, which is essentially, we know how to do this now. That we can let's do it without the animals, without killing them too. Not a bad way to go. Now, I'm going to shift here to the end of our time together by moving from technology into, believe it or not, touch on a little politics and demographics. Because if you talk about the next 25 years and you don't think this through, you're going blind into what's happening here. So the biggest thing here is that there is a huge historical generational shift happening in the United States here. And I'll give you a quick sense of this. Is essentially, this is the demographics of the United States in 2020 by generation. And every one of those is a year, and every one of how many in that year. Well, one thing you see here, in the gray there, is essentially people that, from the economy's point of view, don't matter at some level. Everybody's going to basically buy stuff or work in that middle category, right? So what has already happened? Already happened is half baby boomers have basically retired or they're dying off. And meanwhile, the millennial generation is by far the biggest generation throwing their weight around the American economy, which is why all the US corporations are like, sure, we're for climate change, and sure, DEI, that's all our thing, right? They don't care what the dying baby boomers are saying, particularly if they're in political power. Good, I'm gonna stick with the people who are gonna buy stuff and who are our workers. Anyhow, that is already dominating American culture. You just play this thing out. Gen Z is, by the way, just very similar in all their values. So it's not any kind of shift back to those kind of conservative boomer things. Well, and Gen X I know the Gen Xers in here basically didn't have the size, so you basically don't have the same way to shift the culture of the country. But basically by 2030 already, all boomers will be kind of out of, be still people doing a few things and hanging on a bit. But essentially, but this is 2040. This is the next 25 years. This is like whatever millennials and Gen Z want to do, we're going to do. It doesn't matter what you want to do if you're not in that generation. It's like that generation is going to drive the conversation. And ultimately, by 2050, this whole period, it's just, we don't know what their kids will be. They'll probably be raving conservatives and react to them, so who knows. But anyhow, if you're any kind of business or investor, you got to wrap your head around it. The second thing is the race. These two generations are essentially 50-50 splits. Within reason here. They're also all interdating, intermarrying. All the kids downstream will be people of color. And it's like we're having some Americans are having a hard time wrapping their head around this. But there's nothing going on in these generations about, it's all about fairness and kind of that. What also happened is we talk about immigration. There's been two great booms of American immigration. That first one is in the late 19th century, early 20th boom. That was the European immigration. The second boom, though, when we opened it up to the world, essentially is bigger boom, which started in Reagan, by the way. This wasn't just it was both parties were embracing this for many years until recently. Anyhow, that's a second boom. So what has happened is America is essentially, since the 60s, been watching white people decline and people of color rise as a percentage of the population. White people come down. That's 2020. And we're essentially on track to about 2045. Whites will be a minority. Now, this has happened in California 15 years ago. Whites are about 35% of the population in California right now. It's an awesome place to live. I live there. Wouldn't live any other place. It's not like the world changes fundamentally in any kind of way. But there's people that are worried about that, but this is happening. Texas also is getting close to this. A lot of things are going to happen. Now, so that brings up what I think are the political implications of this. And again, every time I talk on politics, you got to be touchy. So I'm just going to say, listen to me out. Just hear me out. If you don't believe it, great. We can have a conversation at the bar late tonight. But there's two kind of eras of American history. And there's a conservative eras and progressive eras. And essentially, they're baked into the word there. Conserving is kind of let's go back to what worked, and progressive is let's try something new and try something different. They both are valued. One is renewing and valuable things, and one's reinventing because we just can't do the old thing anymore. Anyhow, these things go back and forth in American history. Now, you think, okay, well, how does it take to change it? All it takes is 10% of the population. If you take each of these as 10% of the population, what we've watched for the last 40 years is essentially that there's been a coalition of 60-40 Americans who have been more conservative. And, so, even Democrats were working within the Reagan kind of framework. And, we had a more conservative kind of economy that essentially benefited all kinds of different industries in good ways. Entrepreneurial, started all the tech companies. Anyhow, all it takes is shift. We're in a 50-50 split in the last decade, let's put it that way. So now all it takes is you shift another 10%, and you got a 60-40 majority, which is going to just shape the entire kind of decade. So I am arguing, and I laid out those numbers to you, what we're essentially going to watch is essentially the last time we saw a progressive era was coming off of World War II with the GI generation, the Great Depression, World War II. It was the Great Society, the New Deal, all that kind of stuff we know. We watched with Reagan and all the stuff we've kind of been through. This is the last 40-year thing. We watched how the world worked in that conservative thing. A lot of positive things went in there. It seemed to be, but I would argue right now that you got to get your head wrapped into a similar way of politics that was more closer to what happened in the wake of the war. Instead of like building the world to save the Cold War against Russia, we're basically going to be doing it in solving climate change, among other things. And I'll find this final little thing here, just to put it in terms like everyone kind of understands, but also kind of can push people's buttons. But essentially, this was the high watermark of Republican conservatism, which is Bush's second term. Essentially, he won the popular vote. The Republican has not won the popular vote for the last 8 elections except for this year. He won it, and this was the Electoral College split. This is the last, basically, election where that California politics is coming in the Southwest, the kind of East Coast politics is coming down, including into the Deep South here. And this, now I would argue what's happened since the pandemic is a lot of these millennials are leaving the big cities because they're trying to get homes to have families. These are essentially the changes in population by county. In the first year of the pandemic, by the way, it keeps going for the next couple of years. Look at all that green. Green is where it increased. All the coastal people started moving into where? Texas, Florida, basically the center of the country there. And so I would argue, this is not out of the question, to see battleground states essentially moving down the East Coast and even as far as Texas. And there's nothing comparable coming, red state like California going to turn red right now, or New York. Anyhow, the point is, if that happens, boom, that's another structuring of the whole economy. And with that, I knew I have to basically finish up here on this timing, but I will just say to wind it up, folks, we are going through a world historic moment here. I talked to you in terms of technological terms. I talked to you in terms of the climate challenges. I talked to you in terms, we didn't even get into it, but we could get into basically geopolitical terms, a possibility of a Cold War kind of moving thing here. And if we had more time, that would be my next place I would go here. But essentially, it is an extraordinary moment in human history. You're lucky to be alive at it. And if you are looking for opportunities and kind of into change, you are going to be like a pig in shit. And if you don't, you should probably like hunker down and get ready for the ride, because it's going to be a wild 25 years. And with that, I'll say thank you very much and have a great conference.